Biological annihilation. Scientists say the sixth mass extinction is already underway, and it's worse than previously thought. This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. A, quote, frightening assault on the foundations of human civilization. Scientists are saying it wouldn't be ethical to talk about the state of the world's species in anything but that sort of strong language. For a mass extinction to take place, 3/4 of all species need to disappear. Scientists are saying that human overpopulation, overconsumption too, they're speeding up the process at an alarming pace, and the survival of our civilization is quite literally at stake. 65 million years ago, the last dinosaurs disappeared, along with 75% of all living things on Earth. The cause of this and 4 other mass extinctions before it remains a mystery. As we try to understand what happened, some scientists fear we are fast approaching a similar catastrophe. In geological terms, humans have inhabited the Earth for mere moments, but our presence over the past 200,000 years has been heavily felt. Our growing need for food and fuel has destroyed habitats, eradicated species, and altered climates at an unprecedented rate. So is this quest to better ourselves about to catch up with us? Will we be the 6th mass extinction? On land or at sea, we are the undisputed top predator. Never in the planet's history has a species dominated as comprehensively as we do. Ancient forests, which have stood for centuries, cleared in days to make way for crops. Animals once wild, domesticated for food and transport. And apex predators of the deep, depleted for their delicacies. There are an estimated 8.7 million species on Earth, but just one is using up to 40% of the planet's net primary production for its own purposes. And this dominance has consequences. Extinction is a natural phenomenon, but overconsumption, the introduction of non-native species, and poor management mean we are now losing species up to 10,000 times the natural rate. Scientists fear that ecosystems could alter in such a marked way that they will no longer provide enough food, clean water, or oxygen to sustain any life on Earth. Human interference is not restricted to the living either. By relying on fossil fuels, are we potentially altering our climate in a catastrophic way? Rising seas, acid rain, soaring temperatures, they could all make the Earth uninhabitable. Some scientists believe that climate change was key to the downfall of the dinosaur. Could it be ours as well? Humanity and the natural world are explicitly linked. The way we interact with the world around us is key to the success of all species. Our understanding of the planet's ecosystems may be incomplete, but our effect on them has been profound. Can the tools and technology that have been used to push life on Earth to the very edge be used to bring it back from the brink? Or is our time here on Earth coming to an end? Let's introduce our team for today. Not quite at the Roundtable, but in Boston in the United States. Joining our discussion, we have Professor George Church from Harvard. He says we've learned a great deal from past mass extinctions, and he is trying to reintroduce a form of the woolly mammoth to the world. Also in the US, Peter Brannan, author of The Ends of the World. He's in Maine, not convinced we're actually in a sixth extinction. To my right in the studio, Paul De Silva from Friends of the Earth, who says humans are the reason that many species are endangered and becoming extinct. And we have Professor Jan Zalasiewicz, paleobiologist at the University of Leicester. He thinks the sixth extinction is looming. And let me come to you first of all, Jan, and say, from what you've heard, is it too late to stop this?
It's not too late, of course. It's never. The situation is changing very rapidly, geologically, very rapidly. But let's say if we look at the number of species extinct, the last assessment done a few years ago by a colleague of ours, Tony Barnosky at Stanford, and his colleagues, suggested that only a few % of species have so far gone extinct. But here's the catch. Very many are, in very low numbers, critically endangered and on the edge and pushed to the edges. And their best estimate was that in business as usual, not counting climate change, we would be at mass extinction levels within, let's say, a couple of centuries. That's not counting climate
Professor
change.
Church, is this, in the US, is this all overblown? Are people being alarmist?
It's very important to be thoughtful, so I wouldn't call it alarmist. But I think I'm not convinced that it is a de-extinction. I'm not convinced that it's an extinction. It could be genesis of new species. So, we could say that more people are dying every year than ever before, but more people are being born too. So we need to consider the number of species that are being created, which is enormous.
Well, I'll come to you in just a minute about your work with the woolly mammoth and the DNA of different species, if I may. But let me just throw this to either Peter Brennan or Paul De Silva here. Do you think it's as bad as people are making out, the headline writers? So let's ask Peter Brennan in the US first about that.
Well, I think humans have certainly had a profound influence on the environment. I think just as one slice of that, we've taken 90% of the large ocean predators out of the ocean in the last 50 years. There's estimates that wildlife populations have dropped by half in the last half century. But yeah, as Jan said, if you look at the actual numbers of extinctions in historical times, it's maybe a few percent, maybe less than 1%. So I think it's both frightening what humans' influence has been on the environment, but I think there's also good news that there's still time to save the world. And I think there is maybe a risk in telling people that they're in the middle of one of the worst events in the history of life on Earth, that maybe it will make them fatalistic or resigned when there's still much work to do.
So Paul from Friends of the Earth, what needs to be done?
So it's an interesting debate. It's great you were having it, but let's use it as a spur to action. We know what we need to do is we're intelligent species. Human beings are an intelligent species. We've been doing some very dumb things, but let's use it to prove our intelligence. Let's turn this round. So this can be used as a spur to the conservation effort.
We're also very selfish.
Well, we're selfish, but we can be benign too. And we can look at our self-interest, and I think the intelligence shows us, the evidence, the science, and in our hearts as well. I think we know that we cannot continue to thrive as a species ourselves if we let nature go to the wall. So let's use this as a spur to action over the next decade or 100 years.
But we have to change the way we think, the way we behave.
They do, and I think more and more people get that, absolutely. And there are moves, they're hard to detect, but I think there are moves within institutions, within government, within the world of business. There are companies who are increasingly getting it and realise that their interests are not met by the old thinking of the last century.
Who wants to pick this one up? I mean, if certain species go extinct, then we endanger our very existence.
Well, you mess up the chain, if you like, the pattern of life, and if you do let certain species, key species, go out, then it will have a trigger effect elsewhere. So, am I saying some species are more important than others? I probably am. The question is, we don't know that fully enough.
But also, some species are more attractive to be saved.
Sure.
The panda is beautiful eyes, elephants, and so on.
But again, the whole issue of iconic species can help us do take action for those species which are less attractive.
Yeah, we need to consider the whole lot because we depend upon a diverse ecosystem, because it's diversity that gives a resilience, to adapt to knocks and blows that the Earth always goes through. Some things are very clear. You need to maintain more habitat, and we need to try and keep climate, from warming too much, because we know if it warms too much, then whatever we do with habitat, then creatures will be out of their comfort zone.
Okay, so let's talk about one creature that is no longer with us, and one creature in a moment that we hope will stay with us, the bee, that is endangered. But George Church, first of all, the creature that isn't with us, the woolly mammoth. This genesis, this coming again of creatures, how is that going to help us?
I concur with the arguments that we need to get a control on carbon for the global warming. And one of the biggest risks is the tundra, which contains more carbon in it than the whole atmosphere and all the tropical forests carbon put together ×2 or 3. And that's melting right now. And so one way that has been shown experimentally, and it can just be a part of the solution, is to have large herbivores that punch down the snow in the winter and increase the reflectivity of the vegetation in the summertime. And this can be as big an effect as 20 degrees centigrade. So that's one of the motivations for making hybrid elephants that can survive in the cold. But it's also, if you have a better solution than talk about how to save the tundra carbon, we have many examples of hybrid species in the world today, and I think we're actually creating more species than we're losing. So we don't need to panic about the species necessarily. It's more about human needs that we're really worrying about.
Yeah, Peter Brennan, what is it, 37% of the world's surface of the world is now farmland, according to the World Health Organization. We need food. We're not going to change that, are we?
Yeah, that's been one of the main drivers of this
Well, we don't necessarily need
today.
beef. Beef consumes 23 times the mass that a plant diet would take. So that's part of the reason that we have so much acreage in so much land spent on agriculture, is because we're consuming so much beef.
Peter, continue. Interesting point, George. Thank you.
I agree with that human land use is definitely driving, is one of the main drivers of the biological crisis going on right now. I thought one thing you said earlier, which is interesting, is that whether our species itself is at an extinction risk. And I've talked to paleontologists who think that human beings will actually prove to be extremely extinction resistant for a few different reasons. We're incredibly adaptable. We have language and culture, and we also have a gigantic geographic range, which seems to be important in surviving past mass extinctions. So it might not be a question of whether humanity itself goes extinct, but certainly a quality of life for us and for the animals around us certainly could be.
Nobody seems to be particularly worried. I suppose we have to live for tomorrow rather than centuries hence. But it must be on your minds, mustn't it? Seriously.
Things are moving very fast. When we look at the changes that have been shown so graphically at the beginning, many of those were in the last century, and many since the mid-20th century, in terms of, let's say, habitat loss, land use change, the changes, not so much extinctions, but the changes in proportions of different animals. If you take land vertebrates, we are about 1/3 of the total mass as humans, one species. Most of the rest is the animals we keep to eat, the cows, the pigs, the sheep, the goats. The rest are about 5%, perhaps less. So again, it's a signal of a transformed biosphere, and one which is still moving, and certainly we have to think seriously about it. And I think the word concern is not too small here, simply because it is a moving target, it's a trajectory.
Let's ask you, Paul, to describe what would happen if a creature which you have a fondness for, bees, we know they are in danger. What would happen if they disappeared as a species?
So bees, among many pollinating insects, are pretty important. Bees tend to be the poster boy and girl of the issue of pollination. And you're right, Friends of the Earth has run a big campaign in the UK and increasingly across Europe around the plight of our bees. So we're talking about all types of bee, not just honeybees. And yeah, what would happen if we didn't have bees to pollinate our food? Well, we'd probably still survive, but our diets would be very boring. We'd have very dull, unnutritious diets. So we would scrape along kind of on porridge and rice and things like that. So fine if you want porridge for breakfast and rice for dinner, but the things that make our diets interesting, nutritious, colourful, and worth living for, you know, if you live to eat or eat to live, then bees and other pollinators.
And they are in danger, aren't they?
Yeah, the figures show that 20,000 species of bee worldwide. In Europe, about 1 in 10 bee species is facing extinction. And so we have it within our grasp to reverse that, but it does depend on the kind of towns and cities we want to design and manage, the kind of agricultural landscapes we want to create and get away from the mass industrial
There are just too
farming.
many of us, aren't there? Overpopulation, George Church, in Boston. What do you think?
Well, I actually think this planet could support about 10 times as many people as we currently have. A human being only consumes 100 watts in its biological nature. Some of us are consuming 10,000 watts, so we could easily cut back in ways that wouldn't necessarily involve sacrifice. That's one aspect of it. We could, there are many more efficient ways that we can be using agriculture and not only slowing carbon greenhouse gas emission, we could be reversing it. So most of the efforts that you see are just to slow it down, but we actually should be reversing it from right now 400 parts per million down to about 350 parts per million. There are ways to do that with carbon sequestration. So I think we will continue to grow our population.
Peter, as you sit there looking not only at us but across the top of your computer at the beautiful waters out there with the lobster pots in Maine, can you contemplate this? The dinosaurs became extinct, we don't know exactly why, and the planet survived. Extinction is a natural process, we just have to live with it.
Well, I can actually see a couple of dinosaurs out my window, the bird dinosaurs that made it through that extinction. But yeah, extinction. There's a natural background extinction rate that persists throughout geological history. But there are also these incredibly unusual times where the majority of animal life goes extinct. And I think one of the more concerning discoveries in the last few decades from geology is that a lot of these are driven by severe climate changes driven by the levels of carbon dioxide in the air and ocean chemistry changes. So I think not only do we have to get a handle on our land use sort of things, but we also need to really figure out how to transform the energy system. I know George just mentioned carbon sequestration. A lot of the UN climate, the goal for reaching 2 degrees by the end of the century rely on these massive carbon sucking machines that so far haven't proven to be economical and don't really exist in anything on the scale that we need. So we need to kind of invent our way out of this, I think.
Bring it back to the studio and you two here. Scientists and experts such as yourselves are talking about it. It's making the public domain to some extent. But how are the ordinary people who don't follow these things going to start to notice that there's a change and therefore want to take action?
I suspect many ordinary people are, because while if you like the theory of how and why the world is changing is not widely out there, people still notice what's happening in their back gardens, the way that plant life is changing, the way that the birds in the garden are changing. And where I grew up, in Lancashire, people cared about that, and they put in time and resources to try and keep their local environment as Paul said, as good as it possibly could be. So it's a case of trying to ramping up, these ideas and these kinds of motivations in the way, that George and Paul said.
You see, there has to be a collective will, doesn't there? An international will to make things change. There was a project in Belize where they noticed that coastal waters were becoming damaged. They depended on those for their livelihoods, whether it be fishing or tourism. They put together a project of interdependence, which has actually won praise from UNESCO. Are other governments and other societal groups taking notice of this and doing similar things?
The Belize example is a really good example of how they decided as a society to actually stop deforestation and destruction of the mangroves on the coast and actually start bringing that back. And conservation works. Nature conservation, whatever you call it, actually is very good value for money, and you can get very good returns quite quickly if you stop doing the dumb things I mentioned earlier. And I think that's where you can provide really good ways for ordinary citizens who don't wake up in the morning and think about geological time. They're just wondering what the time is. Give them ways in. Give them, because you're absolutely right, I think people are noticing the shift in the seasons. Just this morning on the radio, I woke up and people were talking about, is it autumn already? Well, actually, it's still late, it's mid to late summer, but people are noticing that. They want some answers and they want to know their role in it. So I think this is where we can connect citizens
what you're
with
talking
governments.
What you're talking about is the circular economy, isn't it? Where we notice a benefit by helping other creatures and other systems.
We've got to get better at all of this, recycling everything we use, basically. You know, in geological terms, most natural systems are wonderful at recycling, and they keep a fairly steady state of matter and energy. We have created very quickly this enormous thing that's been called the technosphere, but it off the biosphere, and it's pretty rubbish at recycling, really. It uses vast amounts of energy, and it creates large amounts of waste. We have to get, it keeps us alive, but we have to get better.
Let's go to George Church once again, if I may, George, and to ask you about this introduction of new species. How does that happen? And secondly, with the woolly mammoth, when are we going to see one?
Well, so we have a growing amount of experience with de-extirpation, where we reintroduce animals into a variety of ecosystems. Examples are the California condor and the bison. The bison went from nearly extinct in the wild, maybe a couple hundred examples, to now 500,000 bison worldwide. So we have experience with that component. We have experience with genetic engineering of species to give them traits that make them more adapted to new environments or to old environments that now suddenly become more attractive. And I think the mammoth is one of those. We have the Asian elephants that are at risk in their current environment where they're at conflict with humans and they have tusks that encourage poachers. If they were made cold resistant by introducing the ancient DNA, which amazingly we can accurately read into computers now from the museum pieces that we have. If you can introduce new traits to them and maybe remove their tusks naturally, then they have a greater survival for that species, but also maintaining as a keystone species the tundra, which is in the Arctic permafrost, which is in great
it's fascinating to hear you describe how that actually sort of, without it, we are in danger. But what is the timetable for you and the woolly mammoth, or the creature that would be part woolly mammoth?
Well, time frames just depend on how society decides whether it's worthwhile or not. The cost of these technologies are coming down exponentially. We've reduced the cost of some of the molecular technologies 1 million-fold in a few years. So it isn't necessarily cost, it's a matter of will and deciding what you want where. Sometimes we move species from one place to another. Some places are more receptive to others. It's not necessarily just a matter of extinction versus genesis. Chris Thomas has a nice book coming out in a month on this is not the next extinction or the 6th extinction. This is a 6th genesis. And so really it's a matter of will as to where deciding what new species we want, because we're creating maybe more new species than we're extincting. Inadvertently, maybe we could be more intentional about it.
Okay, Peter Branham, last word to you, because we're coming towards the end of the program. Optimistic or terribly pessimistic? What's your take on it all?
It kind of depends where I let my mind wander. There are some steps being taken that are encouraging. We're starting to set aside huge marine reserves, which we know is, that's a great way to preserve ocean life. Just have no-go areas where you can't fish at all, because we've really been pretty destructive in the oceans for the past few centuries. But then when you think about the state of the energy system and sort of the movement on that front, it isn't nearly fast enough to stave off things like ocean acidification, which we know could easily doom coral reefs by as soon as mid-century. And coral reefs supply 25% of the ocean's biodiversity. So when I start to think about that, that gets me pretty pessimistic. But I mean, there's smart people like George Church working on this stuff, so I guess that's encouraging.
Fantastic. Thank you all very, very much indeed. And I think just by having this discussion, we all agree we have a duty to look after this place, our home, our planet. The question has been, are we too deeply entrenched in our ways and in the ways that we are affecting it to reverse some of the damage? We've heard some of the ways people are trying to change. Thanks for joining us on Roundtable, to my guests here and also to you at home or wherever you happen to be for watching. It's been Roundtable with me, David Foster. From me and the rest of the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.